Да, давайте начинать. Okay, we will
Так, сейчас,
start,
секунду.
and it will be the online translation to the YouTube. Значит, мы...
Так, все, мы в эфире. Можно начинать.
Добрый день. Мы начнем сегодняшнее заседание. У нас сегодня круглый стол, посвященный торговле, политике, экономическому развитию стран Латинской Америки и российский взгляд на латиноамериканский регион, и на развитие российско-латиноамериканских отношений, на торговую политику Латинской Америки. У нас круглый стол проходит на русском и английском языке. Это официальные языки конференции и симпозиума. Вот в следующий раз, и вы уже говорили об этом, в следующий раз обязательно сделаем испано-русский круглый стол. И я очень рада приветствовать всех на этой конференции. И будем с вами говорить о Латинской Америке и о российских взглядах, латиноамериканских взглядах на торговую политику и экономическое развитие. Я вводное слово сказала на русском языке, но перейду на английский, поскольку трансляция идет в YouTube, соответственно, чтобы у нас была большая аудитория, будем с вами разговаривать на английском. И есть всегда перевод на английский или на русский язык, пожалуйста, используйте в Zoom. Okay, so I switch to English. I'm very happy to see you here in this round table to discuss the trade policy and economic development of Latin America and Russia. And the idea of the round table actually was to compare the visions of the two scientists, very important scientists, both in Latin America and in Russia, actually in Soviet Union, on the trade policy and economic development. And why was such round table proposed by myself and by the organizers? Because our conference, Evolution of International Trading System, Challenges and Prospects, dedicated to the 120th anniversary of Sergei Ivanovich Tulpanov. Sergei Ivanovich Tulpanov was a very famous Soviet scientist, and actually he was a pioneer of studies of economic development and development economics, and especially development of developing countries. And he did a lot of studies on Latin America, Africa, Asia, and he was actually the pioneer in the Soviet economic school on the studies of developing countries. And then I was thinking about his period of studies and trying to analyze his ideas. I found myself that his view on how developing countries should encourage and improve their trade policy, I found a lot of similarities between Raul Prebisch ideas and Sergei Ivanovich Tulpanov ideas. Raul Prebisch, he's very famous in Latin America, maybe not so famous in Russia. Just to introduce him, he's an Argentinian economist. He was the initiator of organization of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. He made a lot of studies on how to develop how to develop Latin America and developing world. He is thinking about the trade benefits for developing countries, how to do trade policy more beneficial for developing countries. And before to start the discussion, so it will be free discussion between our keynote speakers and experts, I would like to introduce our speakers today. And I see that we have Alexis Taribia-Dantas. He's the Dean of the Economic Faculty of the University of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Thank you very much, Alexis, for joining. us, and I'm very happy that we have a collaboration with you, and also our last paper chapter about Russian-Brazilian relations and trade policy between each other, between our countries. I'm also very happy to present Jose Briceño Ruiz from Mexico now, professor of Institute of Latin America and Caribbean Studies from National Autonomous University of Mexico. Dorotea Lopez, Director of International Studies Institutes and actually the WTO chair holder at the University of Chile, Santiago. And I see also Dmitry Vyacheslamovich Razumovsky. Very happy that you join us, the Director of Institute of Latin America of Russian Academy of Science here in Moscow. And Anna Salis Landivar, the Stench, is postdoctoral research fellow from Germany, Helmut Schmidt University. My Bolivian friend, I'm very happy that you join us as well. And Mikhail Vladislavich, yes, Mikhail Vladislavich is here, the representative of St. Petersburg State University, Mikhail Vladislavich Shishkin, professor of the Department of History of Economy and Economic Thought of St. Petersburg State University, who actually he participated yesterday in the roundtable dedicated to Sergei Ivanovich Tulpanov, and he knows and share with us more the views of these famous Soviet scientists. And so let's start our discussion. And I propose to start question by question. And the first question, which I found very interesting, is the technological role in the economic development of Latin American countries and developing countries in general. One of the main ideas of both Raul Prebisch and Sergei Ivanovich Tulpanov was that in order to industrialize the economies, we need to follow the technological progress. And one of the challenges for Latin American countries and developing countries is their social problems in order to promote technological progress, as well as the problem of political and economical structure in order to have the benefits of technological progress and to promote their trade policy and economic development. I found this idea very important and interesting, especially taking into account the fourth industrial revolution, which is very discussable today. And actually in the morning, we had a roundtable on the future of international trading system. And one of the idea of the audience was that the fourth industrial revolution actually will provide the revolutionary changes in the international trading system. So how to actually solve this issue for the economic development of the Latin American countries? And here I would like to ask Professor Alexis Dantes to share his ideas on this topic. Alexis?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. For me, it's still good morning, but I know in Russia it's later. Thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to thank the organizers for this. Obviously, I'd rather be there with all close to talk and see each other, not by through a computer. But, well, I know it's impossible now. Well, about this question, I have some issues to present, not very long. I will be very brief. And the first one is, I think, is the key issue for this question is that you have to stress the central importance of the industry and the central importance to justify every time the importance of the continuous industrialization process, because the fundamental measures of industrial policy have to be justified every time. So what I want to say is that industrialization is not natural. You have to be built. It's not because of market forces we have industrialization. So I think Prebisch is still very, very up to date in this question, and more about the development of the developing countries. So I think Brazil is a very good case to study, because we had a very long trajectory of industrialization, especially from the 50s. And after the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, we have a very few effort to industrialize again. So we have, I will try to make some comparing about this issue with our situation in Brazil. So from a theoretical point of view, the thesis developed by Prebisch of the well-known secular deterioration of terms of trade, what imposed the need for industrialization in peripheral countries. So what he's saying is that if peripheral countries do not industrialize, they will be more and more underdeveloped. So the necessary path for the economic development of the periphery is industrialization. We have to. So we justify the continuous process of industrialization. It's needed. It's imposed for us if you want to catch up, if you want to get better conditions of life for our population. The importance of industrialization for the introduction of and diffusion, of course, of technological innovation is one of the key issues for the rationality of the industrial policies. So we need industrial policy. We need to push the formation, the creation of modern industrial structure, because we have to. We need this structure to introduce more and more technological innovations. So this need to introduce technological innovation, to diffuse technological innovation, and then to industrialize more and more, is that it's very rapidly imposed by the change we had after the third industrial revolution in the end of the 70s and beginning of the 80s, and more. Now we have this industry 4.0, which is a very big challenge for us, still a big challenge, including some developed countries. And you can see what can we do if you have a industrial trajectory, an industrial path in the developing countries, which is not very good as it was until the 80s, like Brazil, like Mexico, like Argentina, like many other countries. So what happened if you do not industrialize, and if you begin, like Brazil, more and more an exporter of commodities, more and more, especially in this century? The problem is that the inequality increases dramatically in two spheres, in the productive structures of central countries and in socio-economic differences. So we have problems because we cannot join the path of industrialization and development of the industrial countries. And more than that, our populations is more and more poor, as it is happening to us for at least 30 years or more. So in Brazil, for example, the picture is dramatic, absolutely dramatic. In addition to an increased technological gap in the last decades, the last years is still accelerated the process of deindustrialization. We are going in the opposite path. We have a very big problem, a very big issue in the country now. Our industry, which was formed for a long time with planning, like in the 50s and then in the 70s, with the second national development plan in 1974 until 1979, 80, we had a very big, we could build a very strong industrial structure, very integrated, completing the phases of the two main technological bases of the post-war, post-second war structure, industrial structure. First of all, the mechanics, and then petrochemicals. In the 50s, we built this structure for automobiles, durable products, and then in the 70s, the petrochemical structure. So we completed the cycle until the beginning of the 80s. After that, we had the situation of the victory of the liberal and then the ultra-liberal parties, like Collor de Mello in the 90s, in the beginning of the, actually in the end of the 18th, in 1989, and then Fernando Henrique Cardoso in 1994. And we have a little gap in the beginning of this century with Lula and the Workers' Party, which we tried to reindustrialize, beginning from the oil industry. But now, after the coup d'etat in 2016, the destruction of our structure is very fast. It's very, very fast. So nowadays, we have almost 45 million people without job. We have 55 people in conditions, in miserable conditions, with hunger again, and an economic trajectory that we depend more and more of the agribusiness as a sector to lead the economy to the future. I think it's a very bad situation we have. I don't see any escape for us with this kind of government, with this liberal point of view and conduction of the economic policy. And just answering your question, more and more we have to think about industrialization to reverse this situation, to change this situation for a better country and a better path of development. So more and more we need to not only do but fight for industrial policy and industrialization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexis. You actually opened very interesting question and discussion about industrialization, deindustrialization, because now the main studies today is about deindustrialization policy, what to do, how to do it. But the question is whether we could go to deindustrialization without industrialization process. So this is very big issue, which interesting to discuss. I would like also to give floor to Anna to share with you about the technological issues and digitalization issues and how it's affect today the development of the countries. What is your view on this topic?
Thank you for the invitation, Alexandra. I'm really glad to be on this roundtable with you all. Technological progress is still a challenge for developing countries. The access to knowledge with high added value is still restricted. And this is a central issue for the development of a country, considering that technological development is associated with economic growth and political development. So the Latin American countries have different degrees of technological development among them. Despite there being some successful cases of technology entrepreneurs in the region, these are still few in number, do not have the necessary support, and they are not into the innovation circuit or global innovation networks. In a classic model of innovation, we have scientific research, technological development, and industrial innovation. In the area of scientific research, there are many ways in which government could support it. For instance, it is necessary to promote organizational change in universities, such as giving professors and students more time and resources to research, publish, as well as establishing a direct exchange with companies. At this point, I'm not saying anything new. This issue has been repeatedly raised. But in some countries in Latin America, progress has been made in this regard, but resources are still not sufficient. And in others, it is practically non-existent. Here, what I would like to highlight as important in this whole process is a technology transfer, that it was also part of the previous proposal. And the importance of establishing real transfer channels. For this, we would have to analyze, for example, the potential cooperation with, just to mention some of them, the China's Digital Silk Road Initiative, that they look for a strengthening internet infrastructure, deepening space cooperation, also developing common technology standards. No, but we have to find a really real transfer channels. Or we could mention also the Germany policy for Latin America, which includes the importance of technology transfer. And another important point is also the lack of vision to promote technological development as a long-term development goal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Yeah, the issue of technological transfer is one of the, let's say, the key in the innovation development today, because it's not easy, especially taking into account the technological revolution, to produce by yourself the new digital technologies. You need a lot of resources, capital, education, in order to provide something new. And it means, on one hand, we need to cooperate in order to produce these digital technologies, but on the other hand, it also the gap between developed countries who are the leading in the digitalization process, and on the other hand, how to capture this gap by the developing countries. And in this sense, it was very important thesis from Raul Prebisch about bottlenecks of the economic development. And he supported, as already was mentioned by Alexis, the center-periphery approach, and said that the developing countries is dependent on the developed one. And also, actually, Sergei Ivanovich Stepanov, in his studies, indicated the vicious cycle. He said that economic underdevelopment was a basis and premise for economic dependency. And while economic dependency preserved underdevelopment. So how to actually destroy this virtuous cycle? This is a very interesting question. And I would like to give the floor for the comments to Dmitry Vyacheslamovich Razumovsky, the director of the Institute of Latin America.
Alexander, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to express my huge gratitude for the organizers for this invitation. And I would like to say that my elder colleagues, they have a very positive experience of cooperating with Sergei Ivanovich Stepanov in the Soviet period. And I asked them before this panel about their experience, about their perception of his ideas, of his figure, and they all admired, yes, his experience not only as a not only as a terrorist, but also as a man with a very serious practical feedback. Yes, and I think that Sergei Stepanov and all the main leaders of the Desarrollism, yes, they are comparable by their size and their ideas. So, answering your question, I would like, first of all, to say that today no one argues with how correctly Raul Prebisch saw the reasons for the vicious circle of poverty or backwardness, yes, but how correctly he saw the way out of this impasse, yes. This continues to be the topic of many discussions today. Let me state right away that I suppose that in general, the strategy of import substitution, industrialization, within the framework of so-called closed regionalism was defective. In different periods, in different cities, circles of Latin America, during the discussion about the most preferred strategy, export-orientated and import-substituting models of industrialization, they replaced each other. The evolution of these approaches was also influenced by the development of more general theories of development and industrialization. For example, the Desarrollist theories of balanced growth or unbalanced growth of Harshman, or neoliberal theories of export-orientated development, etc., etc. It is obvious that CEPAL views on regional integration during the industrialization, during the period of closed regionalism, were not static. Their dynamics was determined, first of all, by the failures of the first integration and industrialization programs, but also by changes in external factors, primarily by the liberalization of world trade order and the increased mobility of capital. At the same time, the change of CEPAL ideas about the ways of integration was not always reflected in the dynamics of the actual policy pursued due to the growing influence of political factors, political internal factors. To be fair, it should be noted that Prebisch himself understood all the risks and costs of the import substitution model. He also took into account the restrictions of the import substitution model identified during the industrialization of developing countries since the 30s of the 20th century. He referred to such problems as a shortage of capital, inefficiency, restrictions of competition, and mistakes in strategic policy. Integration made it possible to solve some of these problems, primarily by increasing efficiency through the use of economies of scale. Yes, one of the central concepts in Raoul Prebisch approach. However, it was unable, import substitution was unable to solve the problems of technological lack, narrowness of markets for a number of goods, yes, and lack of resources. Moreover, Prebisch foresaw the emergence of new specific risks associated with the growth of inequality between the countries of the group and significant trade deviations caused by protectionist measures. Prebisch was aware of the advantages of export-oriented industrialization, which is able to solve the problem of trade imbalance more efficiently and achieve larger markets. But it is necessary to take into account that international contexts prevailing in the time of the development of the Sarajevo approaches, yes, in the 50s, international trade was characterized by a much high level of protectionism, including on the part of developed countries, and multilateral liberalization under the GATT made it possible to significantly liberalize trade only from the 70s, yes, decades after. Thus, import substitution industrialization was perceived as a forced rather than a preferable measure. As we know, both models and development strategies were implemented in Latin America, import substitution and export-oriented industrialization, last one in the countries with military regimes. The paradox is that in both cases, foreign capital still played an important role, which quickly adapted to work in the conditions of closed regionalism. And with the exception of individual success stories, both strategies were generally failed to deliver the expected results. The failure of the two strategies has once again sharpened the debate among the Latin American scientific community. Let me remind you that at the end of the 70s, after Enrique Iglesias became CIPAL director, a new wave of critical rethinking of the export industrialization experience began in the region. These methods, these moods of disappointment or, on the contrary, enthusiasm resembled sort of a pendulum. Yes, Iglesias reconsidered a number of achievements of export industries and the positive role of foreign transnational companies in the development of new industries. However, the Desaraists also pointed to the obvious problem of the development model, as previously indicated, low multiplier effects and weak technological transfer. The reverse side of the medal of the policy of openness was the growth of vulnerability to crisis phenomena and the spring growth of importance of investment goods, which are required for the development of export industries. In many respects, the deterioration of the trade balance during this period led to the subsequent debt crisis which the region faced in the 80s. As the only measure to reduce imports and harmonize industrial development, the Sarajevo saw the balancing of exports development by the intensification of import substitution. It seems to me that the problem of failures was in the absence of in the middle of the 20th century, of the theory of effective interaction with the foreign capital. Michael Porter's theories or the global value chains concept or approach, yes, they appeared much, much later, decades after. Today, we see that the factors of success lay in the policy field rather than in the field of this principal strategy, export-oriented or import substitution. In every strategy in the world, we can find stories of success or stories of failure, yes. In Asia, we also saw the import substitution models, which were successful. Yes, for example, in Japan or in some sort in Korea, based on the national capital. Today, we see that the factors of that national, for example, national innovation policy, and Latin Americans didn't pay enough attention to this. We see it in low share of R&D expenditures in GDP, for example. It is even more important than the choose of the strategy. The quality of your FDI regulation, the quality of trade policy, if it stimulates the integration in global value chains or impedes this process. Now we have a lot of policy implications based on empirical and theoretical study of lots of successful or unfortunate cases. So now we can have a new interpretation, yes, of these initial ideas of Raul Prebisch and Sergei Zulpanov. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dmitry Vячеславовich. It was, the discussion with you about the import substitution. So, and they, of course, the disadvantages of the strategy on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's not so easy to find the way, another way of the development, right, for the Latin America. And here, it's interesting concept of Raul Prebisch that thinking on how to find the incentives for development. And one of the mainstream idea, and today in the morning we discussed this issue, is whether international trade could be the incentive. And Raul Prebisch declared that actually free play concept is admissible in relations between countries that are structurally similar. So his main idea that international trade will be unfair, free trade will be unfair in case of the trade between different countries. And his view was to think on whether developing countries, his view was that the developing countries should receive some preferential treatment from developed one due to this fact. And Sergei Ivanovich Tulpanov also said that the problem of the communication between developed and developing countries caused their some challenges in the development of the developing countries. And here I would like to give the floor to Jose. Would you like to comment the ideas of the this free trade concept and how the developing countries see the possibility of participation in international trade and the benefits, whether it's benefit or not, and whether today we could say that Raul Prebisch was right or wrong.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexandra, for inviting me to be here to share this floor with experts in international trade in Latin America. I think it's actually a quite provocative question. An orthodox and a liberal economist would say, of course, free play exists. Of course, this is a false question. But the reality is one thing is theory and another quite different stuff is real politics. And at the end of the day, free trade is a political creation. There has been moments in economic history where or when free trade was not the mainstream. And protectionism is part of the economic history. You see the national economic experience of the United States in the Abraham Lincoln era, for example, or the national system of economic policy in Germany with Frederick Leeds, for example, or the report on manufacture, for example, with Alexander Hamilton in the US. Protectionism and no free play or free trade was the rule. But okay, what then is, I see that as a provocative question. What is the possible answer for that, according to Prebisch? We're talking about here about Prebisch. And for Previs, this is my argument here, that for Previs, free trade was an ideal, but was not a reality. At the end of the day, we have to remember that the theoretical influences on Previs were Keynes and some Romanian economists or Frederick List, for example. Then, for Previs, for him, the core of the response to this idea of free trade and free play were in the structure of the international economic system. And the structural economic system in Previs, as you know, all people know in this panel, was center and periphery. The international economic system were divided in countries that were specialized in producing manufacturers and other countries that were specialized in producing primary goods. But, and this is the point, the crucial point here, this structure of the international economic system has an institutional structure. I mean, the multilateral institutions created after the Second World War reflected that center periphery structure of the international economic system. In other words, GATT, the General General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, was a reflection, a political reflection of the international division in center and periphery. And in consequence, it's not a surprise that GATT represented the interest of developed economies. As you see the history of the so-called Euro 1 round, from the first Euro 1 round in Geneva in 1946 and the Tokyo Euro 1 round in 1979, we can talk later about the Euro 1 round. In all those rounds, the center of the trade liberalization was manufacturers among developed countries. That's what the concern. And agricultural issues, that was the main concern for the developing world, for the third world, was not part of the negotiations. The first time agriculture entered into the negotiation and the progress in the liberalization was minimal was in Euro 1 round in 1984. And as you see, the agenda after the Euro 1 round is included trade-related issues, intellectual property, government procurement, investment services that did not also reflect the interest of the developing economies. What, for example, regulate intellectual property to protect the patents of the central economies. So the institutionalization after the Second World War represented the logic of center and periphery and were created to maintain the working of that structure of the international economic system. What tried Previs to do in the 1960s when he was appointed as Secretary General of the UNCTAD, the United Nations Trade and Development Conference, tried to modify, he tries to create an, I wouldn't call parallel, but another kind of trade institutionalization that represented the interest of the so-called, in those years, Third World. And UNCTAD was that. Is you see the first report presented by UNCTAD in 1964, if I remember well. The name of that report was the New Commercial Policy for Development. This is quite, if we have GATT, and if GATT was the responsible for dealing and for regulating trade, why do we need to create a new institution that also deals with trade, but especially for development? That is a response to the institutional framework created after the Second World War. And in this new structure, the interests of the third world countries would be represented. And we know the ideas that Previs promoted from GATT when he was UNCTAD, excuse me. He argued that about the existence of the trade gap. This idea of trade gap is new in Preby's approach to international trade. If you see the Latin American Manifesto in 1949, for example, Preby didn't talk about a trade gap. Or if you see his proposals, or Cepal or ECLA's proposal in the 1950s about the Latin American common markets, industrialization was the center of the debate, but not this idea of trade gap. In the 1960s, we are talking about 15 years after the Latin American Manifesto, Preby realized that these deteriorations in the terms of trade was even deepening after the years. And as you see, what was this idea of trade gap? That basically was that there was a fast increase in the demand of imported manufacturers. And at the same time, there was a slow increase in the export of primary goods. Once again, you see the pattern, center periphery. Once again, you see the problem of deterioration in the terms of trade and the problem of the external bottlenecks. And this is the reason why he slightly modified the strategy. And he, Preby, considered that import substitution industrialization must be complemented with export of manufacturers export. This is one of the greatest proposals of this new commercial policy development report in 1964. And that is the problem, the question here. Was actually political conditions for the undeveloped countries or developing countries in the third world to export industrial goods in the 1960s? And we can make that question today. It's easy for with the current institutionality of trade, multilateral institutionality is easy for the Latin American, African, or Asian countries to produce and compete in the trial manufacturers. The question Preby gave to that was quite clear. There are severe limitations in that strategy. The strategy is correct, but how to implement that, how to make that a reality, there are serious problems or limitations. The first is has been talked previously in this conversation, is the technological problem. Because production of manufacturers imply a national system of innovation, imply investment in education. And certainly that was not the case for most of the Latin American countries, including Brazil and Mexico, the most advanced, and Argentina, the three most advanced countries in Latin America in those years. That's the first problem. The second problem is the financial shortcomings, because someone has to pay for modify the pattern of production. So you have to pay to become an industrial producer and stop being just a producing of commodities. Who paid that? Latin American problem. Previous in the second report, in the second UNCTAD report in 1968 in New Delhi, was the second UNCTAD conference, he talked about the saving gap. It's not just a trade gap, also a saving gap. The capability of the Latin American countries and third world countries to have resources to finance the development. So in this case, who can pay, who can finance this strategy of promotion of the sport? The international financial institutions, supposedly. But the international financial institutions, as we know, demand some kind of orthodox economic policies, and in consequence, they have no interest in promoting this strategy further by UNCTAD. And at the end of the day, there is a political issue. And my presentation has this bias of political economy. There was, in the context of the Cold War and in the context of the hegemony of the liberal project promoted by the United States after the Second World War, the Bretton Woods projects, are really interested in modifying the structure of the international economic system? Certainly not. But there were not only domestic factors. When I talk about regionalization and previs, I would like to retain some idea Dimitri has presented in his previous comments, because certainly the strategy failed. I agree, the strategy failed, but not only because political or domestic political reasons, but also because the structure of the international system and because international circumstances, for example, the oil crisis in 1973, for example, we can mention that just for that. So what is the situation now? We have to evaluate the results of private UNCTAD proposals. The only thing we can rescue is the creation of the General System of Preferences in 1964. And that was even accepted in the Tokyo Round in 1979. But, as you know, after the creation of the World Trade Organization in the Marrakech Summit, these kind of preferential trade agreements were eliminated. There is now international trade relations are based just on reciprocity. So if we retake previous ideas, the division, the deep division of the international system between center and periphery has been deepened. Some people could say yes, but what about the cases of South Korea, and what about the cases of Taiwan, or what about the cases of China? And this is what it's hard to argue about that. It's not easy to argue about that, but geopolitical reasons were important in those cases, particularly in the case, for example, of Taiwan, in the case of South Korea, in the context of the Cold War. In the case of Japan, they received important economic U.S. American economic assistance. And the concerning intellectual property, we can say that the United States were quite flexible when the Japanese imitated Toyota, imitated the American automobile models. The situation is quite different today. What is the problem with China? The China do not respect intellectual property because of the political reasons in the 1960s were quite different now. So to end with these short reflections, there is free play? I don't think so. I think it's a political construction. In some cases, free play exists. In other cases, it doesn't exist. And that depends on the political interest of the great powers. And to end, as an example, you see the EU Common Agricultural Policy or the US Agricultural Policy reform during the liberal George W. Bush presidents in 2002. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jose. You actually touched a lot of points which not only Raul Prebisch, but also Sergey Ivanovich Tulpanov discussed. Actually, when you said about this trade gap and the issue of the international trade and its incentive for developing countries, when I studied the works of Sergey Ivanovich Tulpanov, he actually already focused a lot not only on trade, but also on investments. That in order to industrialize, in order to be more competitive and to develop the economy, you do not need only to think about the trade, but more about where to take capital. And that the capital is one of the most important issue for the economic development. And of course, international investments, international trade is very connected to each other. And but this is an important issue to take into account, that international trade is like the first step, but we also need to think about the investments. And another important view that when we speak about this concept, I agree with you that the concept is like an ideal concept of free trade. But of course, on the other side of the coin, we have protectionism and we have autarky. But autarky, both Prebisch actually and Sergei Ivanovich Tulpanov, they said that autarky is not the way out. So the free play concept is not valid, but autarky is also the wrong way of the development.
Yeah.
And both Raul Prebisch and Sergei Ivanovich Tulpanov said that we need to develop international cooperation. But how to build it? On what kind of terms? What are conditions of this international cooperation? Here we need to study more detail. So, and this is an important issue which both scientists are taking into account. And in this field, I would like to introduce you to my colleague. I'm very glad that Yuri Nikitovich Maseykin is with us. It's a dean of the economic faculty of People's Friendship University in Moscow. Yuri Nikitovich, I will be grateful if you share with us the ideas of international cooperations. And I know that you talked a lot about BRICS. So maybe about how the BRICS initiative also helped these international cooperations and in case of our discussions here. Юрий Никитович, пожалуйста.
Спасибо большое, Александра. Меня слышно, да?
Да, да.
Я так понимаю, что есть перевод. Я приветствую всех участников сегодняшней конференции. Я вижу знакомые лица. Я приветствую Алексиса Торибио Дантаса из Рио-де-Жанейро. Мы сотрудничаем с этим университетом. Я приветствую Дмитрия Разумовского, с институтом которого мы тоже сотрудничаем. Ну, конечно, Санкт-Петербург, несомненно, и всех остальных коллег. Когда мы с Александрой обсуждали возможность выступления, я предложил рассказать, поделиться своим опытом участия в разработке ряда документов и организации сотрудничества в области международного научно-технического сотрудничества. И если говорить более конкретно, в рамках такой организации, как БРИКС. Я, конечно, понимаю, что сейчас идет дискуссия в целом о торговой политике, о концептуальных вещах, но с моей точки зрения и международное научно-техническое сотрудничество – это есть один из аспектов такого взаимодействия, который расширяет пути, возможности торговли, взаимообогащения различных стран. И вот опыт организации такого сотрудничества, международного научно-технического сотрудничества в рамках БРИКС может дать некоторые, скажем, перспективу того, как это может реализовываться с участием различных стран. Я начну с того, что в 2015 году страны БРИКС подписали конвенцию о международном научно-техническом сотрудничестве. Эта конвенция давала определенные ориентиры для того, чтобы это сотрудничество развивать. Но надо иметь в виду, что для организации такого сотрудничества необходим определенный правовой режим, который бы существовал как в отдельных странах, так и на международной арене. Россия задумалась о том, чтобы создать такую правовую основу у себя в Российской Федерации. И я вошел в такую группу по поручению Министерства образования, которая занялась разработкой концепции по международному научно-техническому сотрудничеству. Мы изучали практику, существующую в различных странах. Мы, конечно, начали с того, что мы посмотрели, что происходит в целом в мире. Я должен сказать, что мы выделили 3 основных группы стран, где разный уровень правового обеспечения такого сотрудничества. Одна группа стран – это страны, в которых существует свой отдельный стратегический документ о международном научно-техническом сотрудничестве, который создает такую платформу, основу для взаимного обмена научными достижениями. Вторая группа стран, где такого стратегического документа нет, но есть документы, носящие региональный характер. И третья группа стран – это страны, где нет ни стратегического общего документа, ни документа, ориентированного на регионы, но элементы международного научно-технического сотрудничества заложены в различные документы, которые сформулированы в рамках различных национальных стратегий, будь то развитие науки, предпринимательства и так далее. Вот эти три группы стран, они выделяются на общем фоне того, что существует в мире. Мы посмотрели, что происходит вот в странах-участницах объединения БРИКС. В Бразилии прослеживается региональная составляющая. Там действует альянс исследований Южной Атлантики с участием Аргентины, Уругвая, причем привлечены еще и страны из Африки, Ангола и Намибия. В Китае отсутствует единый стратегический документ. Отдельные положения в области международного научно-технического сотрудничества сформулированы во внутренних стратегических документах. В Индии также не регулируется каким-либо образом такое сотрудничество, какими-либо специализированными документами. В ЮАР аналогичная ситуация. Так вот, исходя из этого, повторюсь, что в 2015 году, 18 марта, именно в Бразилии, был подписан меморандум о сотрудничестве в сфере науки, технологий и инноваций. И в рамках процедуры публичного обсуждения проект концепции должен был быть разработан всеми участниками, подписавшими этот меморандум. И вот, как я уже сказал, в 2018 году Министерство образования Российской Федерации, которое с нашей стороны отвечает за организацию такого сотрудничества, поручило группе ученых разработать эту концепцию, на которой мы работали несколько лет. И в итоге в 2019 году правительство Российской Федерации 8 февраля 2019 года такую концепцию утвердила. Тем самым Россия вошла вот в ту группу стран, в которых существует такой стратегический документ, который обеспечивает правовую основу международного научно-технического сотрудничества. Ну и в результате, в результате подписания такого меморандума был создан большой спектр рабочих групп в рамках БРИКС, которые курируют те или иные аспекты сотрудничества. Я могу назвать такие рабочие группы, даже есть весьма экзотические группы, скажем, по океанографии группа. Есть группа, которая занимается развитием твердотельных светильников или светодиодов. Вот и такие даже есть группы. Мне посчастливилось вместе с моим коллегой из Московского института стали и сплавов возглавить рабочую группу, которая отвечает за развитие научно-технического партнерства в сфере предпринимательства и инноваций. Вот здесь уже упоминалась такая категория сотрудничества, как инвестиции, но ведь инновации, которые внедряются в производство и взаимообогащают разные страны, это тоже есть инвестиции, которые дают толчок сотрудничеству и развитию. Так вот, задача нашей группы состояла в том, чтобы найти механизмы такого сотрудничества, который бы позволял обмениваться инновациями, которые бы позволяли развивать взаимное сотрудничество и давали толчок развитию экономики и в конечном итоге благосостояния наших стран. Я скажу о том, что за прошедший год было проведено достаточно много мероприятий в рамках такого научно-технического сотрудничества. А вот то, что касается такого партнерства в сфере предпринимательства, мы предложили совместно с нашими коллегами. Наши коллеги занимаются разработкой специальных таких информационных платформ, в частности, в Бразилии была, со стороны бразильских наших коллег, была предложена такая платформа, которая бы давала возможность обмениваться новыми инновациями и продавать те открытия, достижения, которые могут найти свой коммерческий успех на рынках двух стран. Мы предложили создать так называемые центры трансфера технологий, и создать платформу, мы ее назвали iBRICS, где все участники могли бы предлагать свои услуги по тем инновациям, которые могут быть использованы нашими странами-участниками. Причем эти инновации касаются не только каких-то технологических новинок, но и касаются различных вещей, связанных с развитием менеджмента, каких-то новых условий взаимодействия наших стран. Вот в последней встрече, которая проходила в октябре месяце, нашей рабочей группы рассмотрела такие платформы, которые бы легли в основу общей такой платформы. Ведь не секрет, что в каждой из этих стран есть свои платформы по обмену новой информацией и новыми технологиями, но нам хотелось, и мы к этому стремимся, создать общую объединяющую платформу для всех участников. Я уже упомянул, что наши бразильские партнеры предложили такую платформу взять за основу, Teach Transfer называется, но мы со своей стороны, российские участники, предложили такую форму взаимодействия, как Integrated Vision, то есть концепцию интегрированных подходов к организации взаимодействия между национальными информационными платформами. Мы предложили не взять какую-то платформу, разработанную будь то Китаем, будь то Россией или Бразилией, а создать инструмент их взаимодействия с тем, чтобы можно было новинки, инновации, создаваемые в одной стране, предлагать всем участникам. И вот, собственно говоря, на этом сейчас строится наша работа по взаимодействию. Следующую встречу мы будем проводить уже в Индии. И я надеюсь, что к этому времени мы с нашими партнерами уже придем к конкретному пониманию того, как наладить взаимодействие этих отдельных платформ трансфера инноваций с тем, чтобы мы могли все в режиме таком постоянном режиме обмениваться этой информацией, и если кого-то заинтересуют какие-то новинки, создаваемые в той или иной стране, чтобы можно было эти технологии передавать, конечно же, на коммерческой основе, потому что, как я уже в самом начале сказал, это элемент тоже торговли. Мы торгуем не только товарами и услугами, мы торгуем и инновациями, и это, с нашей точки зрения, будет вносить свой вклад в развитие сотрудничества стран БРИКС, что поможет им обеспечивать устойчивое развитие и повышать благосостояние своих граждан. Вот такая короткая информация, уважаемые коллеги, которой я хотел поделиться, потому что это, в общем-то, практика, которая реализуется, осуществляется в наше время, сейчас и постоянно мониторится всеми странами-участницами БРИКС. Спасибо большое.
Юрий Никитович, большое спасибо. На самом деле, очень важное дополнение, даже скорее к первому вопросу, который мы говорили о технологическом прогрессе и важности инновационного развития. Как раз вот самое начало мы посвятили о том, что без инновационного развития экономическое развитие немыслимо. И один из вариантов развития – это как раз-таки сотрудничество между странами. И сотрудничество это может быть как в рамках региона, да, так и межрегиональное сотрудничество, и БРИКС как один из вариантов такого сотрудничества и развития и инновационного. И продолжу дальше нашу дискуссию. why I include you here and thinking about BRICS. And I would like to think about international cooperation more broadly, because then we speak about international cooperation. First, we are thinking on is the cooperation with the neighbors and the issues of regionalization. And what Raul Prebisch and Sergei Ivanovich Stepanov wrote in their studies is that in order to develop, we need to cooperate. And the idea of the cooperation was firstly in that period of time, in 60s and 70s, is the cooperation in the process of integration and the development of regional blocks, which helps to develop firstly trade and then to develop all other spheres of international economics. And the ideas of the Raul Prebisch and Sergei Ivanovich Stepanov was that regionalization is one of the way out in order to industrialize. And it's one of the opportunity for establishment more technologically sophisticated production within these regional groups. And the idea was that the developing countries have similar problems of limited market size and capital endowment, and agreements of regional integration could help to solve this problem. Actually, developing countries since 60s concluded various free trade agreements, customs union, and we see now modern tendency, establishment of trans-regional free trade agreements, spaghetti ball of free trade agreements, agreements between both developed and developing countries. And actually, today in the afternoon was an interesting session about the regional integration processes. So where to go then, where to go next. And of course, in the 60s, 70s, the main focus was about the European integration, and mainly in Latin American countries, and not only Latin American, but developing what tried to actually build something to copy the European integration. Today, the theory of regionalization and integration is changing, and many questions actually appeared where to go. Whether we need to think on free trade agreements, or we need to think on some new forms of cooperation. Some people study, for example, BRICS, and said that BRICS is one of the possible ways to develop international cooperation in different fields. And we do not need only to think about free trade agreements, and we could actually expire the ideas of cooperation. And maybe this Silk Road initiative is also one of the way how, for example, China see the cooperation strategy. So this is the interesting question about the regional processes on the one hand, and on the other hand, the new challenges which we have today in the international system. So what do you think? Maybe Dmitry Vyacheslavoich, would you like to share the opinions? Because I heard your speech during the roundtable on integration, and I was very inspired about your view of modern. Maybe you will continue and to share here with their audience your ideas about what is the future and how these integration processes or new cooperation processes could help the development of the countries.
Alexander, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to give a brief comment related to the first part of your question, yes, about the regional integration as an instrument, as a way to get scale effects, yes, to guarantee or to promote your global competitiveness. it seems to me that the first theories of Latin American integration, I mean, Prebisch and others, they made a sort of conceptual mistake when they said that a regional market will provide the necessary economies of scale. No, regional market can help you to obtain the scale effects, but in this case, Prebisch and Sipal, they absolutized the mechanism, but forgot about the final main goal. The goal is to create a new, more efficient labor division system between the participating countries. And economies of scale are just one of the principles or mechanisms for implementing the structural transformation, but not the goal itself. Yes, it is also important whether the driving force behind this restructuring is free market or governmental planning. It refers more to your fifth question, I know, but I would like to say a few words. As we know, in Latin America in the 60s, a full-fledged trade liberalization was not carried out. Yes, free trade was only for those industries that were supposed to be created within the framework of agreements of economic complementarity in ALALC and in Mercado Común Centroamericano. Yes, they made maybe a certain scale effect in them, yes, but given the closeness of the market and its small size, relative small size, this didn't allow for a significant effect of scales. Michael Porter, whose book, The Global Competitiveness of Nations, turned 30 last years, yes, has always emphasized that economies of scale must be gained or obtained not in the closed and efficient protected regional market, but in the global market with a high competition. And in general, arguments about the scale effects are becoming less and less relevant today. The modern organization of production is more and more orientated towards customization, yes, and orientation towards differences in the nature of demands between nations, regionals, even sub-regions of nations. The proliferation of new flexible forms of production, such as, for example, additive technologies, makes the ability to quickly, flexibly respond to changes in local demand a major factor of your competitiveness. Yes, the economies of scale that are associated with, conveyors, some huge factories, all this remains important, except for some raw resource-based production or the production of some standardized components as in the electronic industry, for example, but not for the main part of the modern industry. Therefore, the key to the success of an integration association today is not how much it allows to realize economies of scale on the internal protected market, but how quickly and flexibly adopted regulations allow rebuilding and reconfiguring regional value chains. And here the main achievements in the region today has, for example, the trade bloc Pacific Alliance, which was, for example, the first to introduce a very progressive system of full cumulative rules of origin. Yes, harmonized technical standards in accordance with the norms adopted in Asian associations, and how it's called in Spanish, the preferential trade blocs, such as Mercosur or previously the Andean Community, yes, which are orientated on the relatively protected internal markets in the frame of the custom union. We know that they don't work appropriately now. We see that such type of blocks are in deep structural crisis. I think even I can say such a provocative statement that Eurasian Economic Union as a custom union was the last custom union created in the world. The future is with another more flexible, more open formats of regional integration, and we see very good examples now in the Asian Pacific region. For example, the ASEAN, the modern ASEAN, or Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the comprehensive economic agreements, yes, ASEAN +6. all these blocks, they include a lot of elements of the common market with the liberalization of movement of factors of production, yes, but they skip the stage of the custom unions. And Pacific Alliance, it realizes the same very progressive and very modern scheme of integration. And from my point of view, Pacific Alliance is, how to say, it is the image of the future Latin American integration. And also, I would like to give one comment to the very interesting speech of Jose. I would like to, I play a role of the advocate of free trade here in our panel. It doesn't mean that I don't understand all the risks and problems of the free trade, but I would like to mention that in ASEAN integration started practically at the same time as Latin American integration in the 60s. And in the initial stage, ASEAN integration model repeated the model of Latin America. Yes, they also started the programs of import in substitution industrialization in the frame of the closed protected regional market. But very quickly during the decade, they understood all the difficulties of the risk of this model, and they refused this model and changed the model towards the more open model, which now is called open regionalism. Yes, Southeast Asia didn't took the advantage of all these preferences given by the Western countries, as Japan from the United States or South Korea from the collective West, as we say in Russia. They were in the same conditions as Latin America, and the fact that they understood the risks of this model and they still exist, yes, in comparing with Latin American blocks, only Central America system of integration still exists from the 60s, yes. Aladi is a reincarnation of Alad. Now it doesn't play the role, so we may not use it, take it, you can, I'm sorry, we cannot take it into account, yes. Latin Americans show that this model was less competitive and less efficient. I think it's a fact. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, I would like to give them the floor to Jose because Dmitry actually referred to you, as well as I know you would like to give some comments of regionalization processes and these ideas of Prebisch on regionalization. So Jose, some comments from your side, please. Switch on the microphone, Jose.
Thank you. Many interesting things have been said about this issue. First, my first point. For Prebisch, regional integration was industrialization. And certainly, I agree with Dmitry that in current contemporary, globalized world, economies of scale is not enough. But that was not the context in which Prebisch developed his strategy in the 1940s, the late 1940s, and the 1950s. In the 1950s, in the immediate post-Second World War, there was a tendency of protectionism worldwide. And this is also demonstrated. This is the reason why the United States tried to promote in the Geneva, the diverse Geneva rounds and GATT rounds, the liberalization of, or the reduction of tariffs. Then it's very hard for us to ask Prebisch to promote a different approach than that he eventually promoted, because the conditions of the international economy in the 1950s were not favorable to free trade. This is a reality. And that is the reason why he promoted first, as a first step, and I don't know if that is an originality of Prebisch. That was actually promoted by Friedrich List in 1814 Germany. First, we create a common market between the former Germany sub-regional status. I don't know, I don't remember. And then we create a common market. Exactly the same idea. Firstly, we create a Latin American common market. And this is the reason why I don't agree with this denomination of close regionalism. For me, it was not close regionalism. For me, it was an interventionist regionalism, because if we read the paper published in 1968 by ECLAT called the Latin American Common Market, there are clear sections in this paper in which is stated that the long-term objectives, when the industry are mature, Frederick Gleeks once again, is the promotion of the sport and the insertion of the new industrial products, industrial goods, Latin American industrial goods produced in these regionals and these regional industries or in these regional factories, the export of this product to the world markets. That is stated by Previs and ECLAT in 1968 in the Common and Latin American Common Market document. In consequence, I think to call that close, I don't know. It's probably is this dichotomy close, open, and it's very easy to play with both words. But the reality is a little more complicated than that. That is the first point. So certainly, the experience in Latin American failed. I agree. Particularly the Andean Pact experience, that was probably the more theoretically close to, or practically close to, the theoretical approach promoted by Previs. In particular, the idea of creating in Spanish called PSD, sectoral programs on industrial development. But the point actually is that the PSD were actually an industry located, for example, in Bogota to produce cars, automobiles, and the regional market, the Andean regional market, was his market. There is not protection in Venezuela, in Ecuador, in Peru, in Bolivia, and at the beginning in Chile. Free market of that for that production, for that cars made in Bogota, in all these countries. But the reality is it never worked, because no industrial program was approved. They were discussed by technicals in the secretariat, the Andean secretariat in Lima, but they never were approved, and in consequence, they never were implemented. In consequence, it's quite difficult to say it didn't work. We don't know if it worked or not, because it were never implemented. This is the first thing to remember. And they were not implemented because internal political economic reasons, domestic political economic reasons. The liberal groups in Colombia, in Peru, there was in Spanish we call that commercialist, trade by such groups in Colombia, in Peru, obviously in Chile. That's the reason why Chile eventually withdrew the Andean Pact in 1976, that did not support this idea of creating high, non-competitive cars in the Andean community, and the auction, free trade auction, was to buy this from the international market, and in this way, consumers would be favored, and all the, the arguments of the orthodox free trade economy. So the idea of free trade as a mechanism of, we can call that industrialization, but we can call also changing of the pattern of production. That idea, for me, is still valuable. For me, this idea that regional integration is not just a mechanism for the insertion in the global economy, but it's also a mechanism for the transformation of the productive structure, is still valid. Obviously, the strategy is different, and I agree with Dimitri. In the sense that now we cannot think in establishing PSD, an industry in Bogota for the regional market, because production is fragmented. It's this idea of post-for-this and fragmentation of the global production. But regional integration can be used as a mechanism to promote regional values of change. And that is the new way to help or to contribute to the changing of pattern of production. But what is essentially the problem of the need for a change of the pattern of production? That Latin America's countries still depend on the production, on the export of commodities. The recent cycle of commodity high prices demonstrate that. That's the reason why, and Alexis probably know more than me that issue, that Brazil is experiencing a long process of deindustrialization and a return to the production of commodities, soya in particular. So that's idea of regionalism and regionalization as a mechanism to promote what is called also that integration of the production, for me, is valid. It's still valid. It's not just a mechanism to reduce tariffs and insert in the global market. And I certainly don't agree with Dimitri with this example of ASEAN. Because I think in this example, the ASEAN history lacks. ASEAN was originally created as a security-related regional process. The main concern, the ASEAN was created in 1966 as a security structure, not as economic process. The shift of ASEAN to an economic process began in 1996, and the free trade area of ASEAN was contracted in the 1990s. In a moment, both in 1996 and in the 1990s, in which free trade ideas were hegemonic. And in consequence of the comparison, ASEAN in the 1960s, when NAFTA has economic goals and ASEAN has security goals, could be a little bit misplaced. And I think if we compare Mercosur with ASEAN in the 1990s, I think the sample is more valid. And in this case, it's interesting because Mercosur originally was created to promote the insertion of the southern cone economies in the global economy. There is no industrial policy in Mercosur, for example. No interest in that when the Treaty of Asunción was signed, and has failed as a process. Now there is a discussion in Mercosur about flexibilization, et cetera, but after 20 years, early years of success, but after 1999, a permanent crisis, Mercosur has failed. And Mercosur was described, I remember, was still more younger than now. I remember when I was a student, that Mercosur was described as an example of open regionalism, but open regionalism failed. And concerning the case of the Pacific Alliance, honestly, I recognize I'm a bit provocative and heterodox, but for me, the Pacific Alliance is more market in the reality. Market in the reality, if we see the share of the interregional trade between the Pacific Alliance countries, Mexico trade only 8%, send 8% of his exports to the Pacific Alliance countries. The Mexican trade with the United States is around 60%. And I recently read a report from Alicia Bárcenas, Executive Secretary of CEPAL, that stated that interregional Pacific Alliance interregional trade represents 3% of the global trade of those countries. So another example of Pacific Alliance, we have to build regional chain values. The Pacific Alliance is celebrating this year 10 years. Pacific Alliance was created in 2010 in the Lima Declaration. In 10 years, there is not a single example of a chain of value built among the Pacific Alliance countries. So there is in Spanish we said they had good press. They had good. The journalists talked many beautiful things about the Pacific Alliance, but in concrete terms, there are depths, I would say. I'm not saying it's a total failure. There is important achievement, for example, in exchange markets, for example, the coordination of the exchange market, the exchange of students, cooperation among the private sector. But the core that in the Pacific Alliance is described a deep integration, that is free trade and integration of production. In those issues, the Pacific Alliance shows deficits. So to conclude my view, I rescue previous ideas. I rescue the idea of integration, not just as free trade, not just a mechanism to insertion in the global economy, because insertion in the global economy and it's not enough. We need what kind of insertion we want to. An efficient insertion, a competitive insertion, an insertion just as sending to the developed world commodity. We don't need that because it exists already. If we need an efficient insertion in the of the Latin American economies in the global economy, in the global market, the changing pattern of production is still needed. And that was the center of the previous ideas. Yeah, I think that is still valid.
Thank you very much. I like very much the discussion and the contradictions of the ideas. Maybe we will come back to this. I would like to go to the next question, and then with all questions actually are connected to each other, but then probably we also will continue the discussion on the regional processes. I would like to focus on another important question of the Raul Prebisch and Sergei Ivanovich ideas. It's about planning and the role of planning in the economic development. Sorry, actually both Raul Prebisch and Sergei Ivanovich Stepanov put a great role for planning, and they, for example, Raul Prebisch wrote that planning is something more than a new technique, and that developing countries should change their actions and to plan more. And Sergei Ivanovich Stepanov wrote that each country has the potential, developing countries, but the opportunity for improvements still depends to a decisive degree on the socioeconomic nature of planning. And in this sense, I would like to give the floor to Dorothea to share the ideas of the planning, and maybe also give some comments of Pacific Alliance or the discussion which we had, because I think you also have something to add. So please, the floor is yours.
Thanks. I am really thankful to the University of St. Petersburg for the invitation, and mainly to my dear colleague Alexandra Gobal. It is a pleasure to be here with all of you. And I don't know, this idea of be the last one is terrible, because it seems that you're going to say the same thing that everybody before you said. So I will come to the Pacific Alliance and the good press in one of my points. I think that the ones that we live in Latin America, we are a little bit more skeptical about the integration processes. Probably it's because we live them, I think so, or because we expect them and we haven't had any results, any positive results in so many years. So, but I want to, I'm sorry because probably I'm going to repeat some of the ideas that you already mentioned, but it was really a pleasure to me to see that that I was going to be part of a seminar regarding Prebisch on St. Petersburg, because I did economics in Mexico, and I never read Prebisch in my all economics career. So that's something quite clear, and I should say that nowadays nobody reads Prebisch in the economic education, in the economic schools. So that's one of the things that probably speaks about Latin America. Then I want to come back to the idea of a state regulation in Prevish that really was not focused on the management of effective demand, but on transforming the supply side, since periphery's key structural problems were on the side of production. I mean, namely the structural heterogeneity of the productive metrics, the lack of a strong industrial sector, as Alexis mentioned before, and the specialization in exports with low value added, as Anna mentioned. Thus, for Prevish, and for Professor Tulpanov, as we have heard now, the main goal of planning was to stimulate a national industrial sector that could set the economic basis for a dynamic integration into the world economy. As already Jose and Professor Dimitri mentioned, it's important to remember that for Plebish, the import substitution was considered just one of the phases of the process of development. Tariff policies together with the state support were useful tools for temporarily protect of national industrial sector from foreign competition. But it should quickly move to trade openness in order to maintain the process of industrialization. In the 1950s, Prebisch began to criticize the Latin American nations for not initiating the transition from import substitution to export expansion. But for today, the Prebisch perspective helps us to remember that planning cannot be only focused on an organized redistribution of extractive revenues during the commodity boom, as happened in our countries between 2003 and 2013, and probably now. On the contrary, redistribution for Prebisch was unsustainable if it was not together with planning focused on increasing the productive capabilities of the country. In this sense, I think we have to be aware of the inner short terms of policies of redistribution without public measures focused on the productive side. And in some sense, it was the lack of planning, focusing on creating wealth and not only distributing it, that explained the failure of the government during the community boom. Regarding the second part of the question, or the main objective of this round table as the future of trade, I would like to set 4 points. I think most of them have been already discussed, but I think we can come back for them. First, Latin America needs to revisit the development models. As most of you know, we in Chile are now going through a very complicated process of constitutional reform, and mainly oriented to discuss our development model and the big problems regarding inequality that the model has delivered. Because the growth-driven model has shown signs of exhaustion. This is reflected amongst other in the inability of diversifying the export matrix and the low value added export basket. We in Latin America, I could say in a very general form that we have two export structures, both in very low value added export baskets. The northern countries related to low technology manufacture like maquila, and the southern corn that we are mainly anchored in natural resources, or we have been through a process of deindustrialization, as Jose mentioned, like the one Brazil is living. So what we need is a different role of the states. We need an innovation system, as Anna mentioned, a new innovation system with selective industrial policies aimed to building dynamic comparative advantages in knowledge-intensive sectors. I mean, new forms of university business linkages that are quite broken, at least in Chile, I can say, and we need the creation of new agro-industrial sectors taking advantage of developments in animal and plant genetics and biotechnologies. I mean, we need to move towards a different state with a comprehensive and sustainable social protection system based clearly in a new social pact, as we have seen in all our countries. In second place, I would like to, and I'm really interested in hearing all of you in this point, we should think of our recent relationship with China. I mean, if we think about Prevish and the reprimarization of our exports, China has become the first or the second for Latin American countries trade partner, but mainly regarding natural resources in all our countries. And we have on the other side that Alexandra mentioned also también the foreign direct investment issue in this new relation that we are establishing as a region with China. For clearly, we need to be part as a region at least, or to have a voice in the new architecture of the multilateral trading system. We need to be part of this new WTO discussion. As Prevish and Professor Tulpanov has mentioned, and also by Yuri before, I think cooperation is something that now became to be so relevant and has become a priority for all our countries. And finally, the last point that was the point where Dimitri and Jose were discussing, I need reversing the commercial and productive disintegration of the region is an urgent challenge. I mean, the depletion of the intra-regional trade in recent years is very worrying from a development perspective. Just in 2008, the intra-regional trade was 21%, and in 2020 is 12%, and they believe in 2021 it's going to be less. So ECLAC, we are not just only the region that has less interregional trade. I mean, it is going in a downward trajectory. And if you analyze the number, as also Professor Dimitri mentioned regarding the economies of scale, as he mentioned, it's also it's more complicated because it's regarding, we are the most intensive trade in manufacturing before the countries of the region, the one that involves the widest range of products, the one with the highest participation of SMEs. We cannot forget that in our countries, 90% of the employment is on SMEs. The one that includes more women labor force, and therefore the most conductive to productive and export diversification. And we are quite far from this. I mean, I was also in my past life, I was also probably a believer on Pacific Alliance. And I think there were also different political moments where most of the countries were pushing it. Nowadays, I see Colombia and Mexico totally out from this mechanism. I mean, there are not political will in any other countries to push this. And we are, I mean, we are like sitting in a cinema, looking at the rest of the countries getting involved in regional processes, the RCEP on the Asia, Oriental, or even the free trade continental in Africa. We just have the new NAFTA, which quite worrying dispositions, and I hope Professor Dimitri is right, and the Pacific Alliance could boost the regional integration in the region. But I don't really see any kind of any country that could lead this process, that could lead the process of integration. And as Prevish used to say, integration means industrialization. So the cost of development, of developing regional value chains, will also depend on the capacities and will require high levels of coordination among the members of the countries and the regional blocks. So in my opinion, it has been a pleasure to listen to all of you because we need a deeper debate on the new future of trade and the new future of our region. Thanks, Alexandra, again, and to everybody.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. You raised very important questions, and I like very much the references to and the problem actually of the developments of the planning, the development. So a lot of questions which we need to think on, and there is an interesting question. So what actually to do? So in this sense, so there is a secret recipe, yeah, the secret medicine which could help to have more prosperity in Latin America and in the developing world. And here I would like to maybe to listen to some comments from Anna and Alexis. So what do you think about these regional processes? What do you think about the Pacific Alliance and Mercosur, Alexis? So because there are a lot of the issues which is raised today, or we need to think more broader about the industrial development, technological development, and not just to focus on the internal problem of the countries. Anna, Alexis, would you like to make some comments?
Sure, maybe I will make some just short answer. I think there is not a secret recipe. No, there are a lot of points or things that it's really complex, no, to really for bringing Latin America development. But I would like a little to mention with the concept of planning, because I think that is important. Is a controversial concept, and it's controversial because in some countries in Latin America, planning is associated with socialism as an instrument of a centralized government. But what is really planning? And here I would argue that planning should be understood as a vision to promote long-term development goals. So when you ask, okay, what is the secret recipe? I would say one point maybe is to start to think in these long-term development goals, no? And that is really central, as I've mentioned before, for the technological development. So an important point is this is the lack of vision to promote technological development as a long-term development goals, and really to work in the different with the different sectors and level. And one point where we can start is doing what we are doing now, no, with this exchange of idea and more cooperation between our universities, and including also the students. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, very much. Yeah. The issue of the definition of planning is important. And as already you said, and Dorothea's speech was not focused on planning as a strategy with their 5 plans, goals, and so on, but it's more long-term vision. Yes, so what to do. And yeah, I agree with you that the secret recipe is a very contradiction point, but maybe if you look strategically what to do, it will help a lot. Yeah, not just for 1 year, or 2 years, or 5 years, yeah, or even longer, to understand what will happen. But it's very difficult in case if the two political systems and the elections shortage of the years when we have the parties. So it's very difficult to plan if we compare with the political systems. Yeah, very interesting questions. Alexis, would you like to add something?
Yes, not ask exactly a question, but two comments, two very small comments. The first one is that if you still follow the free trade as a main goal for the country, I think in very short time in Brazil we will be exporting soya, oil, cocaine, and cannabis. And I think in this case we have to read a little more Hajun Shan and little less Porter, because I don't know an example of a country that was developed by free trade. And second comment is about planning. And I can say just one thing. China has been growing for 45 years a lot with planning and improving its planning capacity. What can we say about that? What can you say about the response of China to the pandemic of COVID? If you compare with all the countries in the Western, what are the results of planning in China? And in Brazil, we have such an example because of the planning in the 70s, in the middle of the 70s. We could grow a very, very strong and integrated industrial structure in Brazil. So just comments, not questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexis. Maybe some questions from the audience appeared. Please raise the hands if you wish. Okay. Okay, so if there are no any, I think that actually for me personally, it was a lot of ideas which I written down to think on, to improve, to be more in in the discussion of what could be the channel, the routes, to think from very different perspective, and that was great. I'd like to thank you all. I'm very happy that we have this session on Latin America. And as Dorothea said, that Prebisch is not studied in Mexico. Actually, Prebisch is not so studied in Russia as well. But as I am here in our faculty and I am studying Latin America, I also give some part in my lectures about Prebisch and Latin American economic thoughts. So that's why my students personally know about Prebisch and about other Latin American scientists, as well as, of course, about the Russian and Soviet school, of course, yeah. And I think that, and the idea of this panel was to have more cooperation between our countries and to improve their encouragement of the discussion, because I think what is the challenge today is that we are more driven in the mainstream and following the mainstream. And however, I see many different thoughts all over the world and in Latin America and Russia, which are sometimes not following mainstream. Sometimes yes, but it gives at least the discussion, yeah. And we today saw the different points, yeah, between each other, and that's great that we have these different points. And my personal opinion that have the development of the science is then you have this discussion, then you have different ideas. These different ideas gives you the new values, the new improvements, the new developments. I would like to thank you all. That's great. I am so happy to see you online. I would like to when the COVID-19 will over, I hope I invite you to St. Petersburg, and I will be very great to see you here and to have the panel here. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the translators who did a great job to translate into Russian. And I think it was a great idea to have the next session, a Russian-Spanish session. And I will try to do it.
All right.
And yeah, and prepare it and to have this Russian-Spanish session the next time. Thank you very much. And yeah, I would like to thank you all for this very, very fruitful discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you.
Alexandra.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Nice to be with all of you.
Спасибо.
Okay.
Gracias.
Obrigado.
Yeah.
Expasiva estuvo más sofisticado, ¿eh?
Okay.
And after listening Professor Dimitri, how he say mercado centroamericano, he also speaks a great Spanish, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly. So,
bye-bye. Thanks,
Bye.
Alexandra.
Thank
And the
you,
best for the
Alexandra.
rest of the seminar.
Bye, Alexandra.
Hasta luego.
Ciao.
Gracias.